if you can attain enough scale and you can create enough liquidity in the marketplace, that there is probably something you can do to unlock more innovation and more transactions that are happening today.
Alec Sorensen is the founder and CEO of Tradespace. For longtime listeners of Clause 8, you'll recognize that name as the sponsor of this podcast. Today, Alec agreed to be a guest himself. He explains how to enable IP professionals to make more strategic decisions.
It's not that business just doesn't think IP is important. It's that there is value there. People just don't understand how to get there. And because of how it's developed today and how it's managed strategically, it's hard to find that value. And that's how those Rembrandts end up in the attic.
Welcome to Clause 8, presented by Tradespace, a revolutionary end-to-end AI-powered IP management platform that helps companies unlock the value of their IP. This episode is an edited version of Eli's conversation with Alec. You can check out the full video episode on clause8podcast.com. Before launching Tradespace, Alec led an IP commercialization practice at a top management consulting firm, where he facilitated over $250 million in commercialization deals. He's worked closely with Fortune 500 companies and governments across the globe to evaluate IP, facilitate transactions, and develop national IP strategies. In this episode, we learn how Alec uses this expertise to make sophisticated IP strategies accessible to all. And now, here's your host, Eli Mauser.
So today we're lucky to be joined by Alec Sorensen, who's of course the founder and CEO of Tradespace, Clause 8's new partner. So thank you so much for that. When they became a partner and I discovered what Tradespace is, I was like, I need to talk to Alec because I think what Tradespace is doing fits so well with this moment in time about what's happening with patents, about chief IP counsel, about IP executives really taking a step back and thinking about the way they obtain patents and why they're obtaining patents. And that's the reason why I started Tradespace. Of course, everybody has asked me all these questions about Tradespace, and I try to answer them, but I figured we got to get Alec on here himself, and it's better he answer them than me. So Alec, thank you so much for coming on Clause 8.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You're now in the tech business. How did you first hear about patents?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am one of the few non-IP attorneys on our team. So I started my career in management consulting in mergers and acquisitions. And we were asked to essentially do due diligence for companies that were being acquired. And we knew how to do that pretty well. But one day we got asked to look at the IP portfolio that a company was acquiring. And again, we weren't patent attorneys. We knew very little about patents, but we knew the technologies in the market really well. So we said, sure, how hard could it be? It turns out it was quite complex, but we essentially started by digging in, I think, to a portfolio of maybe 250 patents, just reading them end to end. And yeah, knew a whole lot more about them by the end of that.
Did you think like we should reach out to some patent attorneys so they could guide us through this process? Or was it like in the world you were in, we'll figure this out?
I think it probably reflects the broader, maybe hubris the business community has about IP. I think we thought we knew business pretty well. We knew these markets, we knew technologies. And so we didn't need the patent attorneys. Like that part was all secondary, the legal part. We could figure out the business element. We could look at a patent and understand the technology and tell a company, well, you can use this technology for something else. And so I think going into it, we were, I think, probably pretty dismissive of that. And then very quickly, as we got into, well, if you find something that's valuable, how do you actually deploy that into another company? We realized just all of the nuances there were when it came to patent law and all of the things that we were probably glossing over that meant so much to us actually being able to find a productive deal.
But when you value patents, maybe that perspective of that business person who just thinks they know if it has worth, it might be even more valuable. Do you remember how you were evaluating the value of those patents that you saw?
All we thought of about patents was that they were a signpost pointing to a technology, a capability the company had.
Oh, interesting.
And so what we wanted to see is this technology valuable? Is the company using it today? Maybe they're not. If not, then maybe we can find another company that's doing something different that can benefit. And so it was only, again, after we started exploring, well, once you find that company, how do you actually get them to take advantage of this IP that we realized just how important the actual kind of intricacies of patent law were.
So interesting, even more important than maybe the value of that patent assets itself, if you went to sell it in the market, is what did it represent about the company, that they were able to come up with that technology, that maybe they were developing products related to that technology. That's what you set a signpost for that.
Exactly. And that's not to say that's the right approach, but I think it's indicative of how the business community can look at patents going in without education.
Through the process, did you go back to the companies that were being acquired to talk to them about their patent strategies, or how did they come up with this pile of patents?
I think what stood out to us was the lack of strategy, typically. For the most part, we were given large portfolios of patents that had been developed, it seemed almost accidentally, right? They had been the product of multiple M&A acquisitions. They had been developed for products that had been shelved in the past. And so we didn't see a whole lot of strategy. And as we dug in, though, we started to learn about things like encumbrances, essentially by making mistakes ourselves and realizing that, well, we actually need to dive in a whole lot more to the context in terms of how this IP was created in the beginning to understand, does it even have any value outside of our technology-centric understanding?
What made you realize that?
I think it was doing it the wrong way. It was essentially finding IP that we said, well, this technology is super valuable. Let's try to deploy it. And then getting halfway down that path and realizing, well, the government has rights to this IP. And so we can't deploy it. So we learned by making mistakes. In retrospect, I think having good IP counsel going in would have made this a lot more efficient of a process.
And when we were talking about this interview, I think I mentioned the book Rembrandts in the Attic. And you mentioned the goal of Tradespace, and we'll get into it, is to avoid having the Rembrandts in the attic. What was your sense, those companies that were being acquired, were they overconfident or underconfident about the IP that they had?
I think it was just a general lack of knowledge by the acquirers. Almost universally, we had the same context, which was a company coming to us saying, we've already acquired this other company. We know they have IP. There was a slide in the deal deck that the investment bankers put together that said the IP was worth $50 million or $100 million. And we didn't really ask any questions because that was a rounding error. But now we want to see if that value is there. And so it was a situation of them maybe being told based on some value metric that there was value there and wanting us to double click on that.
So this was after those deals were done?
Exactly. Yeah. It's interesting to think about, right? This wasn't a consideration. Is the IP valuable or not? It was more of a piece of context.
Yeah. It's funny because sometimes you hear about deals falling apart because the acquirer, for example, discovers that somebody doesn't have a patent portfolio or anything based on their technology. But in your experience, some investment banker just stuck $50 million on a PowerPoint, and that was enough to convey the value of the IP. You've been in the IP space for a while. What does that tell you about the value of IP?
For one thing, it speaks to the industries we worked in, right?
Yeah.
So if we were in biotech or if we were in pharma, I think those would be very different conversations where kind of the entire value of the company is predicated on a single innovation, right? And the way you protect it, or a couple of innovations. And so we tended to work in industrials, so aerospace, defense, automotive, where patent protection was certainly important, but it was only almost assumed to be a given. You have patents, that's good enough. I think what we learned is that there was a tremendous amount of value that could be had, that was being foregone. So it's the opportunity cost. And that's, I think, where we've really gotten excited at Tradespace. It's not that business just doesn't think IP is important. It's that there is value there. People just don't understand how to get there. And because of how it's developed today and how it's managed strategically, it's hard to find that value. And that's how those Rembrandts end up in the attic.
Before you had the idea for something like Tradespace, do you have any thoughts about, well, somebody should be minding this IP that the company has. Somebody should know this is why they got the patent. This is why they maintained that patent. This is why they got more patents. Do you have any thoughts about how that should be structured within a company? Or did you see anything that might work? Did any kind of those kind of thoughts?
Well, we saw a lot of what didn't work. And we really ran ourselves ragged trying to analyze larger and larger IP portfolios simply by reading patents. And then, we'd go through this exercise. We'd find some pockets of technology we thought that was valuable. And we try to figure out, well, who knows about this? Who can we ask, right? We try to ask the engineers, and they're busy. They're working on the next, billion-dollar pursuit. We try to ask the business leads, and they don't know about it, right? The IP team doesn't have the context. So that was, I think, really striking to us. It seemed as if the IP team had the opportunity to collect that context, right? And it wasn't happening. And so that's, I think, really the genesis for Tradespace, was that you have this team that is so well positioned and could be so strategic within the company. And it ends up missing that opportunity because it doesn't have the right infrastructure.
So it seems the problem that you identified, I want to put words in your mouth, is that the IP team was siloed. Once they got the disclosure from maybe the engineer, maybe because the business person thought what the engineer did is important, after they filed that patent application, whatever happened next got lost.
I think so. And I want to give a lot of credit to the IP teams, right? They weren't just doing this because they were poor patent practitioners. I think what we found was that they were spending so much of their time on the administrivia of just keeping the process going, right? Keeping the trains running on time. They had lean teams. They were trying to keep patents filed, keep annuity payments being made. Yeah. And so they just didn't have the bandwidth to be able to really engage with the business teams, to build those relationships, to build that context that ultimately I think feeds this strategy.
You did have some successes in terms of helping those companies commercializing patents. Any lessons from that about the portfolios that you were able to commercialize? What is it about them that kind of stood out to you that you were able to have some of those successes versus, I'm guessing, the rest of the piles where you weren't able to make that happen?
Yeah, well, what's really interesting, if I think about some of our biggest successes in terms of taking IP out of one business and putting it into another, those businesses initially came to us and said, we don't really think there are a lot of other applications. What we do is so specialized that there's not going to be a whole lot of opportunity. Yeah. And we want you to look, but we're okay if you come back and say there's not much. And it turns out in all of those cases, there was a fairly significant market because of the complexity, because of how specialized something was. Yeah. That actually added to its value in another niche use case.
So it's maybe not a competitor that business was aware of, but they need a solution to a very similar problem, and they relied on that kind of solution.
Exactly. Think lasers to shoot down drones being applied in oil and gas, or waveguides being developed for a fighter jet helmet being deployed in the consumer space.
Which obviously, when you're figuring out the strategy for patents and obtaining a patent and how you, for example, draft the claims, which define the legal rights, something like that, if they put the drone in the claim without realizing it. But I guess in those situations, through luck or whatever else, or maybe a patent attorney who maybe foresaw an opportunity like this, you were able to identify not related, but other industries that kind of rely on that technology.
Well, I think, and this is maybe getting ahead of us, but when you look at some of the companies that are really good at this, the Nokias of the world, right? And they talk about what their process is for making decisions about filing. Yeah. They're looking 10 years out for those new applications. They're trying to understand how is this technology going to be applied 5 or 10 years in the future and making bets on that and structuring their claims that way. And that's why we're starting to see them making a lot of money right now on things like AR, VR, on 6G. They've made the right bets on how to apply that technology. And that's really difficult. And it's something that I don't think most corporate IP departments are structured to do. And as we start to talk a little bit more about AI, I think that's actually one of the areas where it can add a whole lot of value in terms of adding more visibility to these decisions.
I think one of the problems that you mentioned with in-house counsel is that they're so focused on administrative tasks that maybe they don't have a chance to form those business relationships. One thing that I hear from in-house counsel is the business folks aren't that interested. They don't think it's their job for patents, so they're happy to have one presentation a year where the IP folk explain why patents are important. They bless the budget for the next year, and the cycle repeats itself. From your experience, is that kind of how most companies operate? Do you think that's a reasonable, step for companies to take?
Well, I see it a lot, right? I mean, I was talking to the head of IP at a very large corporate financial institution, and he said exactly that. It's more than he can do to get C-suite leadership to buy into IP. He can't get the business leads to buy into IP. And it's challenging. And I don't think there's an easy answer. What I can say, having participated in some of these deals, I've seen successful deals take IP and put it in the main stage. If you can do something once, I'll give an example of a defense company that was able to license some of its IP. All of a sudden, corp dev got interested. They realized, wow, there's opportunity here to do more deals. IP essentially empowered their function. And all of a sudden, you saw IP budgets go up. You saw IP getting championed through the organization. And obviously not everybody can do multi-million-dollar licensing deals, but I think there's other opportunities as well where IP can show that it's actually enabling the business. So you can think about how can IP help engineers push products faster by breaking down some of those barriers that they typically have to go through. So I think if you can do some of that and start to show that you're actually enabling speed the market, enabling getting to revenue faster, then you will see a little bit more buy-in. You're always going to face some of that kind of institutional inertia, but I don't think it's an existential crisis.
It's a pretty easy story to tell if you say, we have this patent portfolio, and now we're getting $100 million. We only spent, I don't know, maybe $10 million on this portfolio, but companies making $90 million. I think Marshall Phelps, who's the former head of IP at IBM, there's a story about him. He changed the accounting about how the different business units get for the patents they file, and that made a big impact in the interest. But then I think you mentioned a different type of story to tell, which is we're getting a product faster to market. How do you tell that kind of story?
So I think about another space in the legal tech world, CLM, so contract lifecycle management.
Yeah.
And if you look back 5-10 years ago, this was the most boring space you could be in, the legal backwater, dealing with contracts. And now in the space, you've got the ironclads, the Evisorts of the world that are, have billion-dollar valuations. They're, sexy companies doing AI. And what they've managed to do is tie their product and the role of the contract administrators and the contract lawyers of the world to revenue, essentially. Because before, you think about it, the reason that sales weren't hitting their quotas is because they couldn't get a contract signed by the end of the quarter, because there's all this negotiating back and forth. Well, let's think about that in terms of IP, right? We're the engineering team. We have a new set of product specs. We want to get them in front of the customer as fast as possible, or the prospect. And one of the hurdles we have is we need to make sure our IP is protected, right? We need to get a provisional patent out the door. And I've seen situations where that process is actually slowed down going to market. We'll see attorneys bending over backwards to try to meet those deadlines. But right now, I think there's still that kind of reputation as the Department of No, saying, well, we need to slow down, we need to wait. And I think there's ways to, again, reverse that story and show how you can actually break down those barriers, how you can help inventors disclose faster, how you can help them, again, get to market faster because you filed faster.
This is very interesting because you actually tied the patents to the sale, right?
Exactly.
It's not some elaborate story. No, the company is going to be selling products and they're going to be able to use those patents to make that sale happen.
Yeah, exactly. I think the hardest job of an attorney is that, their job typically is to mitigate risk. And you never really get any credit for mitigating risk, right? It's hard to prove that, hey, we avoided these 3 lawsuits. You really only get recognition when something goes wrong, right? And you get sued. And so you really have to just change that story and tie it to the company's mission, which is we need to grow as quickly as possible. We need to develop innovative products that differentiate us from the competition. I've actually seen IP departments almost serve a product marketing function because they have incredible visibility into what competitors are doing from IP. If you can package that in a way and get that information succinctly to the product teams, to the business leads, that becomes incredibly valuable. And so those are the types of things that aren't easy to do, but can certainly change the story.
And what do you think about those teams that they were able to do that?
I think what I've seen in a lot of cases is you have somebody coming into the IP leadership role who has a business background. So they're able to speak the language. They're able to understand, well, this is the type of information that's not just valuable to us as an IP team, but actually helps the product team understand where the market is going. And so I think if there are ways for IP attorneys that maybe don't have that background to better educate themselves, to spend more time working with the business leaders, understanding how they talk, what they need to know, that's going to enable that type of a dialogue.
I want to flip that a little bit. Let's say some executive randomly stumbles upon this episode and they're like, I haven't heard anything from my IP team. What should they know? And how should they think about the IP within their company?
They need to know that IP can be a competitive differentiator. And I think you'll see that companies that have built really sophisticated, efficient IP teams are able to move faster. They're able to minimize their risk profile while getting patents prosecuted faster. They're able to, again, protect more of their products, protect more of their innovation. And I think that's something that means a ton to companies. And especially the way we think about IP, we're an early stage company. We haven't filed any patents given how much software work we do, but we certainly protect our IP. And at the early stages of a company, that is probably when some of the most IP is generated. And there's almost no way to go back and capture that if you don't have the right processes in place. And so I think companies that do that well from an early stage are going to have an inherent advantage over the competition that hasn't participated in that cycle.
Maybe this is a slightly ridiculous example, but obviously it goes back to your experience. Let's say you're a new CEO of an established defense company. You step into the role, you've done very little patents. For some reason, you start thinking about it. What is this patent thing? What are the questions that they should be asking? What do you think is enough for somebody in that role to know about their company's strategy?
Yeah, well, I think for one thing, they need to go beyond really superficial questions like how much IP do we develop? I think the best thing they can do is try to benchmark against the competition to understand how are we generating IP as a function maybe of R&D spend versus our competition to see what is the productivity of our R&D. So I think looking at ratios is going to be really important. So how productive is your R&D? Looking at the product by product breakdown. And I think this is something that is really difficult. We were talking about this earlier, to have kind of a product portfolio and say, well, how does that represent my IP? Companies that did this well, I think were really well positioned to then generate new value, to either go out and spin off IP portfolios or to ensure that they're mitigating risk in the right way.
If you could give advice to IP teams out there, is that what they should be really focused on, mapping their patent portfolios to the actual products that are in the world?
We talk about that a lot internally. I think that's a superpower, and it's so difficult to do because every business unit might have a different source of truth when it comes to products. But if you can do that, all of a sudden you can really rationalize your portfolio, right? Because otherwise, 100 patents means nothing to leadership. Is that good? Is it bad? Is 1,000 patents better? But what's helpful to know is that you have even protection across the products that matter most. Or to be able to say, well, look, this product is increasingly important to us and we don't have much patent protection compared to our others. So I think that probably is one of the most important things you can do, although it's also really difficult.
But on a practical level, what would your advice be for, let's say, in-house counsel, a new in-house counsel in a company? They step into the role, they have a pile of, 500 patents, 100 different products in some flavor. Like, where do you even start?
I mean, so it's a developing space, but I've actually started to see AI do a pretty good job of starting the conversation. So why not reframe the conversation instead of going to your business leads and saying, hey, I need you to give me a list of all your products. They're busy, they have other things to do. Why not start by trying to compile that yourself? Essentially, either using an AI model to look at your patent portfolio and try to map that to functional areas, or by using it to pull public information to say, okay, well, let's build a list of all the publicly available products and SKUs and everything else we can see. And that's inherently going to be wrong, but it's a way to start the conversation and to be able to take that to your business lead and say, well, we've started to do our homework. This is what we think you have. Tell us where it's wrong, where we're missing, and then start to do that mapping using AI. All of a sudden, I think becomes really powerful.
I think that's very good advice because obviously the good part about it is a lot of this information is publicly available, and that throwing this patent stuff at the business folk or the engineers and wanting them to do your job, that's unrealistic. With everything else they have go on and gone, at least starting on the road and letting them tell you, no, you're wrong or you're right is an easier way to go. I mean, another reason why it's so hard for in-house, I think, to tell the story is because for a long time, the main story they were telling is we're acquiring our patents for defensive purposes. And this was this theoretical litigation that would happen with some practicing company that would be doing something that you're doing, but those don't often happen, right? Most of the time, if somebody sues you, they probably already considered that possibility. In that realm, any other ways to help tell the story about why it's worth building a patent portfolio besides a couple that you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of things. I think, again, there's obviously a cost associated with it, but I think it can actually be a really good way to institutionalize innovation. So I think you have companies that are doing a tremendous amount of R&D, and frankly, their yield from that R&D isn't great because they're not capturing all of that. So I think by using patenting as a forcing function, because it imposes a cost on it. It says, well, if we're going to keep this innovation, we have to pay however much money, $50,000 to go through that whole process. So I think you can actually tie it to innovation in a really powerful way and frame it as a driver. If we want to be an innovative company, we can say we're innovating, we can spend a whole lot on R&D, but patenting is actually a really good way to institutionalize that, or at least imposing a process where we evaluate everything through that lens. Maybe we don't patent everything. Maybe we keep some things as trade secrets. So I think that's really important. I mean, another forcing function we've seen is the proliferation of non-practicing entities and their kind of expansion into non-traditional spaces. I mean, you see this in the automotive space where companies that have been pretty stagnant for a long time because nobody really sued each other across different automotive companies are now seeing people with big 5G portfolios just licking their chops, or AR, VR portfolios. And I think, with more private equity money coming into the space, they're going to be looking for other areas of arbitrage. And so you kind of also do have this boogeyman of the non-practicing entities entering spaces that have been historically safe and stagnant, and that's going to force some change as well.
You think that force changes because companies now see as that an opportunity for them to monetize their own portfolios? Or
I think it's more risk mitigation still. Understanding that if you do nothing, then you have a big fat target on your back. If your competitors are smarter about this, then they're going to get by, whereas you're going to get tied up in a lawsuit. That's going to slow you down. It's going to take resources.
All good advice, but who should the audience be for that IP message? It's very hard to get the time with CEO, depending on the company, hard to get the time with the general counsel, but maybe general counsel is not even the right person. From the successes you've seen, who do you think needs to hear that message where it resonates?
So I think actually the strategy functions in companies do a really good job of internalizing this. And they typically have really good visibility across the business units, across the R&D functions. And so again, if you can tie IP either to strategic growth or to new innovation, kind of speed of go-to-market, I think strategy functions and corp dev really appreciate that.
And by strategy, you mean those are the ones who are thinking about where the company's going, the products that they're
Exactly, yeah. I do think we've seen forward-leaning CTOs be increasingly receptive to this message. Yeah. I think we've seen a lot of companies where the CTOs, care a lot about having their engineers be more productive, spend less time with IP, but still actually get more out of it. And they actually care about IP. They understand it. Some people obviously may not believe in patents or feel like that's not the right approach. But generally speaking, I've seen CTOs as being pretty receptive to it. They understand it. And so if you can show them a path to gaining that protection that's not tying up their engineers' time, I think that's a really strong audience.
And anything about the cadence? I know we're really going to the practical advice, but let's say you give the one presentation, they buy into your message about tying the products that they're developing to the patent applications you're filing, they're bought in. Is it something that you need to update them continuously on? Because I'm guessing, we'll talk about Tradespace in a minute, but I'm guessing the CTO is not going to be logging into Tradespace to watch how the products are tied to the...
It's true, but I mean, this is a dynamic space. It probably makes sense if you can get corporate buy-in for this to be in a board meeting. If, again, it's incumbent on the IP team to package this in a way that their stakeholders, whether it's the CTO, whether it's corporate strategy, can synthesize very easily, because they're not going to be in any IP management system. But if you're having a board meeting, it's talking about, hey, we need to deprioritize this product, we need to move into this space, being able to very quickly tell a story in terms of what does that mean from an IP's perspective. That means we have a lot of dead weight here, we can jettison that maybe, and then we have a lot of white space here. We have gaps. We need to invest. That might mean funding the R&D team more. It might just mean being more productive from a patent perspective. But I think getting to a point where IP supports those arguments, I think is really powerful.
The example message that you delivered is show some strategic thought, right? You're not just saying, let's just get more patents to cover more products and everything will be great. You're saying maybe there's ways to more strategically think about our budget. Maybe we don't need it in some areas and we need it in others. How should the in-house counsel figure that out? I know you say look at competitors, maybe look at how many patents they're getting, but any thoughts about that?
I think in-house counsels get a bad rap here. I think people will throw around this perception of them as not being strategic, not being tied to the business. And sure, there's ways I think a lot of IP counsels could learn to be more business oriented, but I think a lot of them are capable of that. And a lot of them want to be doing that. And the reality is, it's just difficult when you're spending 120% of your time making sure you hit all of your deadlines, right? Because you might not get fired for pitching a strategic angle IP. You do get fired if you don't file the patent that ends up leading to a lawsuit. And so I think a big part of it is figuring out how do we first restructure our team or our processes so that the head of IP and the IP attorneys on the team can pull their heads out a little bit and just think. I think they're all equipped with the reasoning and the logic to be able to digest this information and frame it strategically. I think it's just getting away from the day-to-day.
One thing I hear from in-house counsel, when I, in my day job, I share analytics with them, for example, about their competitors. The question I often is to get, now what? You could come up with some creative strategy based on that. Some say, it's paralyzing. It's like, it's an overwhelming amount of data. And some of them actually really do know their products, their business very well, that they have a gut level feel about the patent protection that they need to be getting to successfully help their companies. What role should analytics play, and what do you think is the best way?
Well, that point about analysis paralysis is absolutely fair. It's something that, as a leader myself, we deal with. We have 50 different metrics that you could use to measure SaaS, software as a service, success as a business. There's things like annual recurring revenue. There's customer acquisition costs. There's MRR, net dollar retention, right? There's 20 different things. And I can throw them all on a slide and talk through that with the board. But again, you don't get a whole lot of value there. It gets washed out. So I think the same advice that I get from kind of some of the best investors that we work with applies to IP teams, which is to pick some North Stars. And it's going to be different for every company, but to understand what are the metrics that we think that we truly believe are going to dictate our success. There might be other things, right? We might track a dozen competitors. We might be able to slice this IP 20 different ways. But if there's one or two things that matter more than anything else, what are they, right? What is our yield from R&D? IP per dollar spent on R&D in each product area. But figuring out what those North Stars are, figuring out how to communicate the value of those North Stars to your leadership, and then just hammering that home, I think is what you need to do.
One thing you hear from companies, well, we get patents for a lot of different reasons, and they range from making inventors and some business group happy to actually protecting super important products where we might end up litigating with competitors. And the patents that you might be getting are very different, right? But within a huge organization, it gets all lost in this one big shuffle. Is that a realistic thing to have a portfolio that tries to meet a lot of different goals at the same time? Or is it, you really have to, like you say, pick those few North Stars, figure out what is really truly important and build the portfolio around that?
I think that this goes into building a really successful team, right? Some of those metrics matter as you get down into the organization, right? You might have individual IP attorneys in specific business units, and their key metric is how many invention disclosures can we collect from these inventors? Or maybe what is our net favorability rating from inventors? How do they talk about this process? But as you go up, all of those metrics need to get rolled up, I think, into one thing. So even though IP at large businesses is dynamic, it's multifaceted, it's nuanced, I think if you're going to successfully communicate it to leadership, you need to be able to reduce it to one or two North Stars. And again, as you get down the organization, you can have people who care about some of those much more nuanced metrics. But as you go higher up, I think you have to do that.
That's good advice. I was talking about Tradespace, which I'm guessing was designed to solve a lot of these problems that we discussed. But when you were starting the company, is there a certain problem that kind of stuck out to you that you wanted to help address?
Yeah, absolutely. The core thesis early on was that there is a tremendous amount of value in these IP portfolios, and that value doesn't get recognized. And that happens because, again, IP teams don't necessarily have all of the context that's generated from the moment an idea is disclosed all the way through filing a patent. And so we wanted to really enable better context-enabled decision-making at a portfolio level by capturing everything that happened across the life cycle of a piece of IP.
I was actually talking about your product the other day to an in-house attorney, and I said, yeah, the cool thing is that from the very beginning, when you started invention disclosure, it gives you ideas about if you wanted to commercialize this patent one day, how you would be able to do that until the end. And they seemed excited, but then they said, well, but will they help me do that? And I think there's almost like a faith that a regular in-house attorney will have the resources to do that by using any tool out there. And you've actually done it. You've helped commercialize patents. From that standpoint about using Tradespace or any other kind of tool out there that to give confidence to attorneys, at least that they will be able to advise their own companies if they do want to consider commercializing, how that would be possible.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, so this was a big part of our business in the early days, right? We had this hypothesis that if you had all this context, if you had all the data, you could find really valuable assets, you could predict who needed those assets, and you could bring the two together. And I think that holds true. The problem is exactly what you were saying, is that most teams lack either the expertise to be able to go out and run an effective campaign, or just the bandwidth, right? They're doing this off the side of their desk, right? I know Fortune 500 companies that do a fair amount of licensing revenue. That's all done by IP attorneys whose day job is collecting disclosures, reviewing them, managing prosecution processes. So I think it's probably not realistic to expect that any tool is going to change those two things. You can automate a lot of it, but you still need to have somebody who's managing this process, who's building relationships with potential other parties. So I think the companies that have done this well have worked really closely with corporate development. So they've found other stakeholders in the company whose job it is to go out and do deals, and they've brought them into the process. And they've shown them that, hey, if you can do this well, there are deals to be had. You can use tools, you can use metrics to show to a corp dev team, this is why this IP portfolio is strong. And this is why it's underutilized. And then this is why these 10 companies are going to pay money for it. So now go out and see if you can package this.
If you go on the Tradespace website, the one thing that caught my attention was the section IP Marketplace. And it has different patent portfolios, and some of them actually have a value. Can you tell us, how did that come about? What's your vision with that?
That was the initial genesis, right? We thought that there was a marketplace that could be built. If you created enough liquidity, if you enabled price discovery, you can bring interested parties together and you can unlock innovation that otherwise just wouldn't happen. What we've learned as a company since then is that, and it's very difficult to completely automate a transaction. But what we found is that there are organizations that have a really acute desire to do this. And so we've kept our marketplace open. But I think that as you get more scale as a business, you learn more. We manage licensing deals for large companies, small companies. We know a lot about kind of royalty rates. And of course, we don't disclose that, but that enables us to potentially provide really good advice as to the value of an IP portfolio, to make connections between interested buyers and interested sellers. And the great thing is that since IP is a public asset, you can do that as a third party. And so I think our vision is still, if you can attain enough scale and you can create enough liquidity in the marketplace, that there is probably something you can do to unlock more innovation and more transactions that are happening today. We're not going to eliminate the need for brokers or outside counsel in this process, but I think we can create more volume that's just not happening today because there's not enough liquidity.
Yeah, and long-time Close 8 listeners know that's been quite a theme about the dream of this kind of liquidity, everything from auctions to exchanges, and they don't quite work out because I think some of the issues that you mentioned. Is there anything that has surprised you about the way any of your customers have been using the Tradespace platform that kind of maybe when you're designing you didn't anticipate?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've really taken a workflow-centric approach, right? So we wanted to enable organizations to build really flexible but powerful workflows, understanding that everything in the IP department is a workflow, right? You're getting from invention disclosure to filing, you're going through prosecution, you have a process of managing your portfolio. And so I think we initially thought as a leadership team, we needed to make this as flexible as possible so that we could accommodate all these different workflows that were already in place. And we do that and it works. But increasingly, I've seen companies that really didn't have good workflows or processes in place. So they're actually using Tradespace as a forcing function to create process in the first place. We thought that process was going to be in place across the board and we would have to accommodate that. In fact, what we're seeing is people are really pushing us to tell them, well, what do you think is an effective kind of industry standard for evaluating a disclosure quickly? And they're saying, okay, well, let's get this in place so we can force everybody to do this to make sure that every invention disclosure gets sent to this subject matter expert and that they view this material for everything.
Well, thank you for joining Clause 8. I want to ask you, somebody might be listening to this and think, wow, Alec is creating something really cool in the IP space. What advice would you give about maybe a software tool or a service that's different from what's being provided now in the IP space, about being successful with that and making that successful and growing into a business like you have?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's focusing on that North Star that's enabling your stakeholders to actually develop value and generate value from it. I think it's really easy, especially in this kind of AI boom, to get caught up in the world of the possible, what you could do with AI, right? There's so much you could do. But if you're not actually solving a problem that an IP attorney is waking up every morning and thinking about, you're not actually helping them feel better about their job, feel better about themselves, enable their team to do better, pitch to management better, then it's really a challenge. So I think for everybody, it's, again, going back to that North Star, what drives you as a company, what drives value for the people who you want to serve. And if you can do that well, you're going to be successful.
Thank you, Alec. Thank you for joining Clause 8. I'm excited to share your story.
Well, thank you, Eli. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, you're in luck. We have published the full video interview where Alec continues to discuss how Tradespace is enabling IP professionals to make more strategic decisions. Check it out on clause8podcast.com.